Welcome to Storytime with Murph. I am your aforementioned Murph. Today we're going to continue from Robert W. Chambers' story, The Repair of Reputations, which is in his 1895 collection, The King in Yellow. As I broke in with the last episode, this story does mention suicide, racist tropes, and anti Semitic tropes. For the racism, irony, and I would say for the suicide, these are all to be taken as ironic rather than the actual leanings of the author. Or at least that's how I read it. So, continuing on. Oh, as I remember, put as a part of your coffee house rotation, put us in your book buying rotation. We have events here all the time, such as an art show that'll be here on Friday night. Okay, now let's get back to the story after a sip of this delicious, delicious coffee. Which you can buy at the author shop. It was, I remember, the 13th day of April 1920 that the first government's lethal chamber was established on the south side of Washington Square between Wooster Street and South Fifth Avenue. The block, which had formerly consisted of a lot of shabby old buildings used as cafes and restaurants for foreigners, had been acquired by the government in the winter of 1898. The French and Indian cafes and restaurants were torn down. The whole block was enclosed by gilded iron railing and converted into a lovely garden with lawns, flowers, and fountains. In the center of the garden stood a small white building, severely classical in architecture, and surrounded by thickets of flowers. 6 Ionic columns supported that roof, and the single door was of bronze. A splendid marble door of the Fates stood before the door, the work of a young American sculptor, Boris Yavin, who died in Paris when only 23 years old. The inauguration ceremonies were in progress as I crossed University Place and entered the square. I threaded my way through the silent throng of spectators, but was stopped at the but was stopped at the 4th Street by the cordon of police. A regiment of United States Lancers were drawn up in a hollow square round the lethal chamber. On a raised tribune facing Washington Park stood the governor of New York, and behind him were grouped the mayor of New York and Brooklyn, the inspector general of police, the commandant of the state troops, Colonel Livingston, military aide to the President of the United States, General Blunt, commanding at Governor's Island, Major General Hamilton, commanding the garrison of New York and Brooklyn, Admiral Buffby of the fleet in the North River, Surgeon General Lansford, the staff of the National Free Hospital, Senators Wise and Franklin of New York, and the Commissioner of Public Works. The Tribune was surrounded by a squadron of hussars and National Guard. The governor was finishing his reply to the short speech of the Surgeon General. I heard him say, "The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end an existence which may have become intolerable to him through physical suffering or mental despair. It is believed that community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now, the government has determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country. It remains to be seen whether or not that class of human creatures from whose desponding ranks new victims of self-destruction fall daily will accept the relief thus provided." He paused and turned to the white lethal chamber. The silence in the street was absolute. There a painless death awaits for him, who can no longer bear the sorrows of this life. If death is, let him, if of this life, if death is welcome, let him seek it there. Then quickly, turning to the military aide of the president's household, he said, I declare the lethal chamber open. And again facing the vast crowd, he cried in a clear voice, Citizens of New York and of the United States of America, through me, the government declares the lethal chamber to be open. There was a solemn hush. The solemn hush was broken by a sharp cry of command. The squadron of hussars filed after the governor's carriage. The lancers wheeled and formed along Fifth Avenue to wait for the commandant of the garrison, and the mounted police followed them. I left the crowd to gape and stare at the white marble death chamber, and, crossing South Fifth Avenue, I walked along the western side of that thoroughfare to Bleecker Street. Then I turned to the right and stopped before a dingy shop which bore the sign Hallberg Armorer. I glanced in at the doorway, saw Hallberg busy in his little shop at the end of the hall. He looked up and, catching sight of me, cried in his deep, hearty voice, Come in, Mr. Castaigne. Constance, his daughter, rose to meet me as I crossed the threshold and held out her pretty hand, but I saw the blush of disappointment on her cheeks, knew that it was another Castaigne she had expected, my cousin Louis. I smiled at her confusion and complimented her on the banner she was embroidering from the colored plate. Old Hallberg sat riveting the worn greaves of some ancient suit of armor, and the ting, ting, ting of his little hammer sounded pleasantly in the quaint shop. Presently he dropped his hammer and fussed about for a moment with a tiny wrench. The soft clash of the mail sent a thrill of pleasure through me. I love to hear the music of steel brushing against steel, the mellow shock of the mallet on thigh pieces, and the jingle of chain armor. That was the only reason I went to see Hallberg. He had never interested me personally, nor did Constance, except for the fact of her being in love with Louis. This did occupy my attention, and sometimes even kept me awake at night. But I knew in my heart that all would come right, and that I should arrange their future as I expected to arrange that kind of Dr. John Archer. However, I should never have troubled about visiting them just then, had it not been, as I say, that the music of the tinkling hammer had for me this fascination. I would sit for hours listening and listening, and when a stray sunbeam struck the inlaid steel, the sensation it gave me was almost too keen to endure. My eyes would become fixed, dilating with pleasure that stretched every nerve almost to breaking, until some movement of the old armorer cut off the ray of sunlight. Then, still thrilling secretly, I leaned back and listened again to the sound of the polishing rag, swish, swish, rubbing rust from rivets. Constance worked under the embroidery over her knees now, and then pausing to examine more closely the pattern in the colored plate from the Metropolitan Museum. "Who's this for?" I asked. Hallberg explained that in addition to the treasures of armor in the Metropolitan Museums, of which he had been appointed armorer, he also had charge of several collections belonging to rich amateurs. This was the missing greave of a famous suit which a client of his had traced to a little shop in Paris on the Quai d'Orsay. He, Hallberg, had negotiated for and secured the greave, and now the suit was complete. He laid down his hammer and read me the history of the suit, traced since 1450 from owner to owner until it was acquired by Thomas Stainbridge. When a superb collection was sold, this client of Halberg's bought the suit, and since then the search for the missing greave had been pushed until it was, almost by accident, located in Paris. Did you continue your search so persistently without any certainty of the greave being still in existence? I demanded. Of course, he replied coolly. Then for the first time I took a personal interest in Halberg. It was worth something to you, I ventured. No, he replied, laughing. My pleasure in finding it was my reward. Have you no intention to be rich? I asked, smiling. My one ambition is to be the best armorer in the world, he answered gravely. Constance asked me if I had seen the ceremonies at the lethal chamber. She herself had noticed cavalry passing up Broadway that morning and wished to see the inauguration, but her father wanted the banner finished, and she had stayed home at his request. Did you see your cousin, Mr. Castagain, there? She asked, with the slightest tremor of soft eyelashes. No, I replied carelessly. Lewis's regiment is maneuvering out in Westchester County. I rose and picked up my hat and cane. Are you going upstairs to see the lunatic again? Laughed all Halberg. If Halberg knew how I loathed the word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It arouses certain feelings within me which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly. I think I think I shall drop in and see Mr. Wilde for a moment or two. Poor fellow, said Constance with a shake of the head. Must be hard to live alone year after year, poor, crippled, and almost demented. It's very good of you, Mr. Mr. Castagani. Castagani. Yeah, it's Castagani. Woo! To visit him as often as you do. I think he is a bit vicious, observed Halbert. Beginning again with his hammer, I listened to the golden tinkle on the greave plates. When he had finished, I replied, No, he is not vicious, nor is he the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our lives to acquire. Halbert laughed. I continued, a little impatiently. He knows history as no one else could know it. Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in details, that were it known in New York that such a man existed, the people could not honor him enough. Nonsense, muttered Halbert, searching on the floor for a fallen rivet. It is nonsense, I asked, managing to suppress what I felt. Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and the custards of the enameled suit of armor commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken stoves, and rag-pickers' refuse in a garret in Pell Street? Halbert's hammer fell to the ground, but he picked up and asked, with a great deal of calm, how I knew that the tassets and left cuirassier were missing from the Prince's Emblazoned. I did not know until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day, he said. They were in the garret of 998 Pell Street. Nonsense, he cried, but I noticed his hands trembling under his leathern apron. Is this nonsense too? I asked pleasantly. Is it nonsense when Mr. Wilde continually speaks Of you as the Marquis of Avonshire and Miss Constance. I did not finish, for Constance had started to her feet with a terror written on every feature. Halbert looked at me and so slowly smoothed his leather apron. That is impossible, he observed. Mr. Wilde may know a great many things. About armor, for instance, and the princes emblazoned, I interposed, smiling. Yes, he continued slowly. About armor, maybe. But he is wrong in the regard of Marquis of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's traducer years ago and went into Australia, where he did not long survive his wife. Mr. Wilde is wrong, murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm. Let us agree, if you please, that in this one circumstance, Mr. Wilde is wrong, I said. Okay, that's it for today with Stories with Murph. I will see you tomorrow. And also, be cool.